Good morning and welcome to the Meet Us in the Garden presentation for April, Victory Gardens in 2021. Jane Osbaugh is our presenter for today.
Okay, so we're going to talk today about Victory Gardens. And the first thing we want to really understand is, what is a Victory Garden? And so I found this definition on the internet. A Victory Garden is a vegetable garden, especially a home garden, that is planted to increase food production during a war. And they were really started during World War I, when there was a lot of food shortages in Europe due to the war, because they were actually fighting on the farm fields, as well as all of the men were actually in the war. So there was no one there really to fight. So our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, said food will win the war, because that was really how obviously you can't have an army if they don't have food, and there was food shortages. So the effort and the American government really got behind producing more food in the United States so we could ship them to our allies. And so they encouraged individuals to plant more of their own food so that it would free up what our farmers produced in order to send overseas. And in order to assist that, our government produced a number of pamphlets on both growing food as well as preserving food. And in 1917, George Washington Carver wrote one where he actually first used the term Victory Garden. So that's where that term comes from. And during World War I, over $1.2 billion worth of produce was produced from home gardens. And so therefore, that amount of food could be sent overseas to support the troops. Then in World War II, similar thing happened. There was actually rationing in the United States of food, tin, and gasoline. And so again, people started to plant gardens again. And even Eleanor Roosevelt planted gardens on the White House lawn. The government again provided pamphlets on gardening and canning. And in 1940, towards the beginning of the war, half of all households had a garden of some type. And by the end of the war in 1944, there were 22 million Victory Gardens in the United States that produced 8 million tons of produce, which was almost 40% of the fruits and vegetables consumed in the US. And so that's pretty impressive when you think about it, that much of our food supply could be produced from home gardens. And so where did they have these gardens? Well, they had them in backyards. That's kind of the obvious one. But like this picture, they also had them in front yards. They had them in city parks and other public spaces. And they even had some on rooftops. So that's that's kind of the history of Victory Gardens. But as we fast forward to 2021, and COVID-19, and you would say, well, we're not really in a war, so how can this be a Victory Garden? But we are in a war. We're in a war against a virus, and we're also in a war against empty grocery store shelves and closed restaurants and rising food costs, which are, many of those are a result of the pandemic. And so because of that, a lot of people have wanted to start vegetable gardens. And so what we're going to spend the rest of our time here this morning really talking about is, what are some considerations and things that you need to know in order to have your own vegetable garden in your own yard? So the first thing to think about is, what type of garden or what type of space do you have to have a garden? Many of us are blessed to have a yard where we can plant actually an in-ground garden. Some of us don't have a yard, but we do have a patio or a balcony where we can have potted plants and so forth. And those of us who don't even have that, we might have the opportunity to participate in a community garden somewhere. And if you don't know of one, you can always start one at a church or something like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about, assuming that you've decided to start a garden, what is some of the science behind actually having a garden? And we'll start with, what do plants need? plants need a place to live, just like you need a house. They need a house. They need a place to live. They need warmth. I mean, we can't grow vegetables for the most part in the middle of the winter here, so they need warmth from the sun. They need air to breathe. They need water to drink, and they need food to eat. So we're going to talk a little bit about those, because when you think about us, we need a house to live in. We need heat and air conditioning. We need oxygen to breathe. We need water to drink, and we need food. But the way those are provided to us is different than how they are provided to plants. So we're going to start with food. With plants, plants don't have the ability to consume things the way we do and chew them up like we do. But just like us, their real basis is that they need certain vitamins and minerals. And so these are the minerals, for the most part, that plants need. And so then how do they get those? The first three, we're going to focus a little bit on the first three right now: the hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And this is something that you probably learned in biology class when you were a child. So plants take carbon dioxide from the air and water, and through a process of photosynthesis with the sun. So when the sun hits those green plants, it creates a chemical reaction within the plant that converts that carbon dioxide and water, which is H2O, hydrogen and oxygen, into oxygen and sugar. So oxygen is the byproduct, which they breathe out so that we can breathe it back in. And sugar, or the kind of energy for the plant. So that's the first three. And most of the needs for hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon then therefore are satisfied through the air and water. But what about the rest of these? Most of these are not available in the air or typically in the water. So they have to come from the soil. And again, the plant doesn't actually eat soil, contrary to what some people may think. They don't actually eat the soil. But water becomes important again, because water is really the transportation system that is used by the plant in order to get those minerals out of the soil and into the plant. So the plant will suck up the water, the minerals dissolve and attach themselves to the water molecules, and then the plant in the roots absorbs that water. That water then moves up into the plant, into the various areas, and then that's how those chemical or those minerals then get into the plant. So if you remember the list on the left-hand side of the screen: hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, and then now nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are what we consider the major elements that plants need. And these all come from the soil, but oftentimes you'll see fertilizer. And most synthetic fertilizers only contain these three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And you'll see these numbers. You'll see on fertilizer packages numbers like this. This one is 18, 24, and 12. So this is actually a ratio. So potassium is the same thing as potash. And so this one has a ratio of, for every 12 parts of potassium, there are 24 parts, or twice as much, phosphate, and 18 or 1.5 times as much nitrogen. So as you think about what your plants need, if you need lots of nitrogen, then you might want a fertilizer that has a very high nitrogen number, the first number in your fertilizer. But if it needs lots of phosphate, you would want one like this one that has a higher phosphate number, or maybe a higher potassium number. And these are actually used for different purposes within the plant. So it's important to understand when to use what type of fertilizer. So, but what about the rest of these? So most synthetic fertilizers do not contain calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and all the rest of those on the right-hand side of the screen. So where do we get those? Well, we talked about getting them from the soil before, and nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium can also come from your soil. So let's talk a little bit about soil. The soil is made up of 4 major components. The first one is mineral, which is really the ground up rocks that have been ground so finely that they are sand. If they're ground even further, they're silt. And if they're ground even further yet, they become clay. And so if you've got a clay soil, it's just very, very fine bits of rock ground up. Soil also contains water and air, and it also contains organic material. So organic material might be the living and the dead organisms, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But let's talk a little bit about what's really, when you talk about the mineral versus air, water, and organic material, what you want in an ideal soil is that about half of your soil is air and water. That gives it the ability for air or for water to move through the soil, for air to be inside of that soil, so that water and air can get into the plant roots. And so that leaves about half of it that is actually the dirt, the mineral portion and the organic portion. And only about 5% of the total, or 10% of the non-water and air portion, would be organic. But the organic part is extremely important for getting those basic chemical elements out of the mineral soil, because those help to break it down. So, properties of good soil. So it produces, let me go back a minute and talk a little bit more about our organic material. Organic material is really what breaks down those living organisms within the soil, which might include a worm, like this picture, might include a bug, might include amoebas and nematodes. It also includes viruses and bacteria and fungi. And those little microscopic organisms are what break down all of the dead material within your soil, and also breaks down the mineral material, the clay, sand, and silt into those basic chemical elements, so that the plant can absorb them and utilize them. So that the organic material becomes very important, and that's really what releases all of those other chemical elements that is not available in the fertilizer. All right, so if we go back to this slide, some properties of good soil: they produce healthy, high quality crops. They don't require a lot of high amount of fertilization, and it's not contaminated. So if you can have soil that produces a lot of crops without a lot of extra fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, then that's a good thing. Also not contaminated. There's several areas a lot of places where, depending upon what was on your property prior to you purchasing the land, or what else is around you. So for example, I have a sister-in-law who lives in East Lake, real close to the power plant. And so we were very concerned about whether or not her soil would be contaminated with mercury or other things. Another property of good soil is that it it supports a lot of soil life. So remember, we talked about that live portion of the organic matter within your soil. It needs to support that. And in order to support that live population, you have to have dead things in the soil too, because they will not continue to live on just the clay and sand and water and air. They need dead things in there to break down and eat, because that's what they eat. It resists erosion and nutrient loss. So if you have a lot of erosion of your topsoil, of your soil, then that's not a good thing. But also runoff from your soil, from your ground, loses nutrients, particularly nitrogen. Nitrogen has a tendency to escape from our yards in water, in rainwater. So and that can then cause other problems downstream, like algae blooms and so forth. It stores moisture during dry periods, but it also soaks up rain. So it stores the water, but it also drains well. So that can kind of seem like a contradiction, but in reality, remember that soil needs to have both water and air in it for most of our plants to survive. And so it needs to be able to soak up the water, keep it there so it doesn't run off, keep it for dry periods, but it also needs to continue to have air in it, because if you don't have air in the soil and because there's too much water, then your plants will literally drown, just like we would drown if we were stuck into a bowl of water and didn't have any air. And then another nice little quality is that it warms up quickly in the spring. You think about a day like today, it's going to be in the 70s today, and we want to be able to go out and plant. Well, we can't quite plant yet because our ground is not warm enough. That's one of the reasons why we can't plant yet. That and the fact that it's not going to stay in the 70s. So when you think about soils and soil contamination and what's the amount of elements that are currently in your soil, one of the best ways to really find out how much fertilizer and additions and so forth that you need to make for your soil, and whether or not you've got contaminants in there, is to do a soil test. And there's from the Extension Agency, we recommend doing soil tests through there are a number of places you can get soil tests. We provide, or will have for sale for you at the Extension office, a test that's done by University of Pennsylvania, and you can stop by the office. You can call and make an appointment to stop by the office on Tuesday or Thursday from 8:30 to 4:30 and purchase one of these soil tests for $10. And then you would also pay the postage to send it in. Or in the email, in the handout information, we provided some links for you to go and get the submission form and the sampling instructions so that you can do that without having to stop in the office. But again, you'll have to still pay that $10 plus postage. So when you go in and pick one up, this is what you get. You get an envelope, and inside of that envelope, there will be the form for you to fill out and some instructions on how to do the soil sample. And you'll notice that in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to put your name and address. In the upper right-hand corner, if you've picked this up from the Extension office, it will have the address of the Extension office. And the advantage of this is that then a copy of the results of your soil test will be sent to the Extension office. And if you have any questions about the information that's on it, then you can call the office and they will help you interpret it or give you some additional information on that. But the address that's on this particular slide is wrong. So I'm going to give you the corrected one, because for those of you who go out and do the website without stopping at the office, and you want it sent to the Extension office, you'll need this address to put on there. As you fill out this form, it's moving down on the left-hand side. There's just an ID. So this is primarily for people who want to do multiple tests. Maybe you've got a garden and a yard or something like that. A crop code, which you'll find off of the back of the form, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then if you're doing turf or lawn, there's what type of grass. And then on the right-hand side of the first page, It has additional tests that you may request, and you'll notice that there is a cost for each one of those. So if you have purchased the test or the information, this packet from the extension office, you will have already paid your $10 for the basic test. But if you want any of the rest of these, then you'll need to send in a check for that. However, if you have not purchased it, you've just gone online and printed this out, then you'll need to include the $10 for the basic test in addition to any of the extra tests. On the back of the form, you'll find all of your crop codes. And so the center top section is home garden, non-commercial fruits and flowers. And then, so what you'll do there is you'll find your crop code there. The top one there, 5010, is mixed vegetables, but you'll find some other ones on that list that may apply to you. And so what you'll want to do is, if you're really just testing your vegetable garden, you'll want mixed vegetables. However, if you're trying to do fruit trees or lawns or things like that, you'll want to choose one of those other crop codes. And the reason the crop code is important is because the recommendations that you get back will be specific to the type of crop that you have selected. And then you will also have instructions on how to take your soil sample, and you'll package it all up and you'll take it to the post office and you send it in. And a week to 10 days later, depending upon whether or not you do email or mail, how quickly you'll get the information, you'll get your results back. And just to quickly talk through here, the beginning, the first section, really the first page, talks about what your results are. At the top, it kind of has some highlighted information about some of the key things that you have requested or that have been tested, and whether or not they are below or above or optimal levels. And then at the bottom, it has some more specific details about the numbers. And then in the middle, it has some recommendations, fertilization recommendations and so forth. And then page 2 has some more additional information about the results of your test. So you can take this then to figure out whether or not you need to add fertilizer or not, or amend the pH of your soil or not, or things like that. And again, if you have any questions on that, you can always call Tom DeHaas at the extension office. All right, so considerations then for your garden. Sun. A few things that you need to make sure that you know. So remember that sun is required for that photosynthesis in order to create or to generate those first 3 elements that the plants need. And a couple of things you need to understand here is you'll see the terms full sun, partial sun, and shade. Full sun is anything that is 6 hours or more in your garden. Partial sun is about 3 to 6 hours, and then shade is anything that is 3 hours or less. Most vegetables require full sun, 6 hours or more. And one of the things that's interesting to know about that is that doesn't mean sun up to sundown. So sun up to sundown in Ohio and in central and northern Ohio is about, in the longest day of the year is about 13 hours, and the shortest day of the year is about 9 hours. So if you are getting sun about half the day, you can grow most vegetables at least half of the day. There are some vegetables, primarily the greens, that you can grow in partial sun, particularly once it gets really hot. So for example, spinach will bolt or go to seed, send up a flower stalk. That's called bolting when it gets too hot. But if it's in the shade in the afternoon, it will not tend to bolt as quickly. And so there's benefits, therefore, of growing some types of things in partial sun, primarily greens. When you're placing your garden, think about water, because remember that was that other real critical thing for those first 3 elements was water. And unfortunately, in Ohio, we don't get a lot of water in the heat of the summer. And so you need to make sure that you have access to water, because you're going to probably have to supplement the rainwater in your garden at some point during the year. So think about where you're placing your garden, because you don't want to drag 100 feet of hose out all the way out to your garden if you don't have to, or worse yet, 20 buckets of water every other, once a week. And then another thing to think about is planting season. And so we have spring, summer, winter, and fall in Ohio. And you probably all know that we don't really plant anything much in the fall, and certainly not in the winter in Ohio. However, we do have spring and summer, and you'll hear the terms cool season crops and warm season crops. And a cool season crop is something that can grow in central Ohio, or sorry, northeast Ohio, in Ohio, that could be, that will tolerate light frost, but it does not tolerate frozen ground. So kale and spinach and lettuce and things like that, broccoli, cabbage, which is why you'll see those in the garden centers now. Those are what's considered cool season crops. And when it gets too hot, they don't do well. Then there's the warm season crops. Warm season crops would be things like tomatoes and peppers and zucchini. And those will not tolerate frost at all. And so in order to plant those, you really need to wait until after the danger of frost is over, which in this area is mid to late May. So don't plant your tomatoes now. Wait until late May to plant tomatoes, but you could plant broccoli now. Another thing about those is that germination temperature, the soil temperature is important as well. So, our soil is not really warm enough yet to germinate. Even though lettuce would grow here at this time of year, it won't germinate because the ground is probably too cold. All right, so how do you figure out planting season for a different crop? There are several ways. When you look at a seed packet or a plant tag, you can tell. So if you look at this particular example of a seed packet, it has a map, and it shows Ohio is green, and green says you can plant this from March to May, and then again from August to September. So this is what we would consider a cool season crop, because it's planted during those cooler seasons and will grow in a time period when you might have frost. Another things that words to look for is when the ground is workable would be considered a cool season crop, or after the danger of frost would be considered a warm season frost. So if it says don't plant it until after the danger of frost, or don't plant outside until the danger of frost, that means it's a warm season crop. Succession April through June actually will mean that it can grow either in the cool season or the warm season. So carrots are a good example of this. You can start planting them in April in the cool season, and they will grow and produce. But you could also plant them in June, and they will grow during the heat of the summer as well. And the reason the word succession really means plant them multiple times so that you can harvest all at multiple times as well. So carrots, obviously you put one seed in the ground and you get one carrot. But if you want carrots all summer long, then if you plant some now and then plant some more 2 weeks later, and then some more 2 weeks after that, then you kind of stretch your harvest out. And then, so indoors 6 weeks before last frost, this is another one that would be considered a warm season plant, but the growing season is too long for us to really be able to grow it in Ohio if we planted the seed. So tomatoes, for example, often have 120 days, and you'll find this information on your seed packet. It would be 120 days from the time you put the seed in the ground until you get your first tomato. Well, if you wait until the end of May to plant your first tomato seed in the ground, it will be the 1st of October before you get your first tomato. And that doesn't leave much time to get any more tomatoes. So those types of plants we would recommend, the recommendation would be you plant them 6 weeks prior to that last frost date inside in a protected area that will get sun, or either in a greenhouse or in a lighted area, or by plants that somebody else has already done this, and then plant outside after the last frost in late May. All right, so we've talked a lot about some of the science and how do we actually grow things, but what should you grow? So my first recommendation is grow what you like. If you don't like Brussels sprouts and you're not going to eat them, don't bother to grow them. Also, grow what you maybe you can't get in a grocery store. So for example, I really like Swiss chard, and Swiss chard is difficult to find in a grocery store. Sometimes you can find it in farmers markets or specialty stores, but it's hard to find consistently. And so I like to grow Swiss chard because I have a hard time finding it. And if you're a beginning gardener, I would suggest you grow things that are easy. Start off with things that are easy to grow and start off small. So I don't recommend, if you're a brand new gardener, going out and plowing up your entire backyard, because you're probably going to be overwhelmed with all of the work to maintain it and all the produce to maintain it. And you don't need 20 tomato plants unless you're going to produce, you're going to turn it all into tomato sauce. So easy ones to grow in the spring, cool season crops: lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, and other greens. Onion sets. So an onion set is when you go into the nursery or into a seed store and you see these little, they look like little baby onions that are about the size of the end of your finger. That's called an onion set. And so you plant those out and they can become onions, or green onions. A lot of people eat them as green onions. And another one that's really easy to grow is radish. And radishes typically are some of the fastest producing produce. They typically only take about 30 to 40 days before you can harvest your radishes. In the summer, some of the ones that would be recommended are tomatoes, peppers, and zucchini, or most of the herbs. So most of the herbs are warm season crops as well, or they are perennials, but they don't really get going until well into the season. So a perennial is something that comes back every year. An annual is something that has to be replanted every year. So it's hard to fail, but it's worse to never have tried to succeed. So my first recommendation for trying to plant a vegetable garden is to try it, because you will never succeed if you don't try.